Welcome back to Close Mode. I'm here with Brian Dietmeyer, and we're about to be jumping into what we call strategic negotiation. Brian wrote a whole book on the topic, and I wanted to take the podcast to actually break down the four major sections of strategic negotiation. I, of course, am the rookie, and Brian here is the master guru who wrote the book on the topic of how to do this. So, Brian, I'm so looking forward to just picking your brains on this. Even from the last series we did, I think a friend called me and was talking about selling their business. And I was using just our last conversations, thinking through well, how much do you know about the buyer? What are their criteria? Do you know what their options are? Did you rank stack their options against the criteria that they're looking for? I'm starting to walk through the negotiation. So you're already retraining my brain on how to think and put the negotiation on the front of the conversation. So I can't wait to break down strategic negotiation, your 4-step process. And we're going to be covering the first process in this episode. So in the process, you kind of lay out the first step is estimating or getting an idea of what they're looking for. Can you tell, kind of give me a summary of what it means to estimate at the beginning so you're ready down the line?
Yeah. And as a guru, by the way, I feel like I should be wearing something guru-like. I will try for our next podcast. But I think the important thing to start with is estimating, planning is part of the negotiation. People think of negotiation as the tactical piece, right? Where words are flying back and forth. But we need to think of estimating and planning as an integral part of the process, right? It's great strategies, drive great tactics things. So when we think about estimating, we like to, there are only a couple moving parts for negotiation, which you and I have talked about before, right? We already know that the buyer is going to reference his or her alternative, and then they're going to put pressure on us to give stuff away. So when we estimate, we need to think about what is their most likely alternative, and more importantly, how do we stack up against that? And then we also need to think about, in addition to price, what are all the other commercial terms we need to agree upon, right? So we need to know what their alternative is, kind of how we rack and stack, what we know, what we don't know. And the same thing with a commercial terms plan. We already know pressure is going to come. Where's the pressure going to come from? And what are all the terms that are going to be involved in this deal, not just the one or two that they want to talk about.
So when you're talking about estimating, you're not even just talking about estimating how much their budget is for the thing. You're talking about estimating a whole category, multiple categories of items so that you are armed with the right information. Is that right?
There's two things. If we think about the most common tactic is same thing, cheaper, right? So they're talking about their alternative. They're talking about commercial terms. So those are the two things. That's where 97% of the dialogue is going to be. So we don't want to overcomplicate this. It's just a question of saying, okay, we know they're going to refer to some alternative. It's going to be your competitor. Yeah. It's going to be build it myself. It's going to be do nothing. And then we need to look at, when they're comparing us to that competitor, what should they be using and how do we align? And there's a lot we're not going to know at this stage, but this is our first draft through of thinking through. I think people often ask, well, what if they have 3 competitors? Choose the most likely one. And then think of this in terms of the customer is making a decision. It's very helpful for me to frame this part away from negotiation into decision making. So customers comparing you and do it themselves side by side. Who should be involved in that decision? What is the criteria they should be using? And that's enough for this step. And then the other part is they're probably going to be beating us up on price. We already know that. But what other commercial terms? Length of contract, volume, liquidated damages, liabilities. We want to think through, estimate the holistic view of all the commercial terms. And we'll talk about later why that's important. But at this step, it's just enough to go, who's the alternative? Who should be involved in doing that analysis? What are the criteria they should be using, putting us side by side with someone else? And then what are all the commercial terms that we're likely to end up in talking about in the end game? And by the way, Dan, go ahead.
What part of the negotiation process are you doing this estimation in? Are you doing this pre-discovery call or is this after discovery call?
Yeah, this is pre, and it's a great question because it's also people often think about negotiation. If we use a sports analogy, which I'm often hesitant to use, except for this one, people think about negotiation as the 20-yard line for people who watch football. You're in the red zone, and I'm talking about the 51-yard line. You've talked to a few buying influences. You know that they're going to buy something from you, or at least it's on the table that they might buy something from you. This is when we need to start thinking about estimation. If it's a renewal, we need to start thinking about this 6 to 9 months out, right? This all depends on your sales cycle and how much time you take to do this work. We've modeled this where you can think through the other side's alternative. You can think through the commercial terms 5 minutes before you get on the phone for these very short cycle, small deals. But if you're looking at a $10 million renewal 9 months from now, you might have 4 people in a room thinking through this stuff for 3 or 4 hours. So the amount of work you do in estimating expands and contracts relative to the opportunity and how much time you have.
That was going to be my next question. I'm like, what does this actually look like? Is this a one pager? You're
Yeah.
like, well, it depends on how big the item is we're selling here.
You could brainstorm on a flip
it could
chart.
be a long strategic document.
Yes.
It could be a sticky note.
Yep.
Just depends on how big this thing is.
Yeah. It most likely a flip chart, with you and someone else for, if you spend 20 minutes doing this, which will lead into the other steps, you're still immeasurably better than what most people do because you're beginning to prepare for 97% of the pressure that's going to come your way.
In your book, you talk about the consequences of no agreement.
Yeah.
Or your CNAs. How important is it to have those prepared in this estimation stage?
Yeah, well, that's one of the 2 categories. One is, what is the other side's alternative to you? And what are the consequences of them choosing that alternative? And that's where I was referencing this notion of decision criteria. Getting out of the negotiation mindset and saying, look, and basically negotiation is both sides are deciding to accept or reject a deal, right? So in that framing, it's really helpful that, when the other side's making a decision to choose you or someone else, who should be involved, what are the criteria they should be using? And later we're going to get around to getting deeper into this. But at this step, it's enough to just do that.
So that's what the consequences are. So you're essentially putting up their alternatives. Let's say one of them's your head-to-head competitor, and then there's some other solutions that are similar but not quite the same thing. Are you actually documenting, again, more or less, about what the consequences are for this prospective buyer if they go with said alternative?
Yeah, and the reason,
is that what you mean by consequences?
Yeah, and the reason we use the word consequences is we want this to be objective analysis. We don't want to just list everything horrible that happens to them if they choose to build it themselves or go with our main competitor. We want, and that's why I like to change this to decision criteria. What are all the things they should be thinking about? And some of those are going to be good if they make that decision. Some are going to be bad. And that's what we want, is good objective analysis to know. This is the reason this consequence of no agreement thing is so important. If you'll indulge me for about 1 minute, we've done about $10 billion in win-loss analysis. And the one thing, the lead thing that comes out of that practice, the gentleman who leads that practice said to me one day, winners win when they show customers how they meet their needs at higher confidence and lower risk than some alternative. And this is based on 12 years and $20 billion of win-loss analysis. So this is what we're trying to get after, right? If we're looking for those areas where we, increase the probability we're going to move some things in their organization when they buy our stuff, we're going to have some impact on them, and we're lowering risk associated with them buying whatever they're buying from us. And that's who wins deals most often. Sometimes customers make stupid decisions, but more often than not, this is why we win and lose. So this is why we start there. And if the second piece is the commercial terms, if we can get clear on why us versus that alternative, that's going to allow us then to have more gutsy commercial terms discussions, which is the second thing that we're brainstorming at this phase.
That makes a ton of sense. I remember Alex Hormozy is probably one of my favorite marketers, but he kind of says along the same things. Like one of the major factors you can add in terms of value without changing anything is increasing the perceived likelihood of success.
Yes.
Perceived.
Yeah.
The more they believe that you can fulfill the thing that they need, well, the more value. They're willing to pay more for it, even if what you're doing is almost the same as your competitor. They're going to pay, like if you're going to a gym and they're going to help you lose weight, and they've done 1,000, they've gone through it. The last 1,000 people that signed up have all lost X percent of weight, and you can show after case study after case study, you're like, take my money. It could be like 3 times the cost of your competitor. But if you can be like decrease or increase the perceived likelihood of success, that's going to win.
And that perception part is key. And we hear this a lot in today's market, that people are not commoditized, but the things are changing so quickly and competitive advantages are being copied so quickly that you used to have your long-term strategic advantage that might last 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. They're lasting a quarter, 2 quarters, maybe now. So we've got to keep this analysis fresh. And you're exactly right. Even if we don't have massive differentiators, but we can start understanding their decision process better and linking what we do to what they're trying to get done. This is the first step in doing that. And you're right. We win on perceived value because maybe the next person came in and just did a product pitch. And we're coming in and making alignment between your organization is making a decision on this technology, right? Let's be able to line up with that. But we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves at this point. It's just saying, what is that alternative? What is the criteria they should be? If they're making a really good buy, what's the criteria they should be using to compare us? And then what are all the commercial terms that we're likely to have to agree on in the end game? That's all we want to do here.
Yep. So pre-discovery call based on what you know about them and can find out from them from just maybe even a little bit of public information, just browsing their website and thinking about who their customers are and what they're doing if they're B2B, right? Like just get an idea of like who else are they likely to go to that are companies like this? Who else have we sold to before? And what other competitors have we gone up against in this particular vertical?
Yeah.
If you have multiple verticals.
And most people know,
and then writing them down.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, most people know this, Dan. If you're on the 50-yard line, right, which is where you should start thinking about negotiation, you already have a sense of who the most likely alternatives are or who the alternatives are and which one is most likely. And so we do that one first, right? So we already know that. And then I like the point you were just making because embedded in your organization, the seller's organization, you could and should be educating your customers on how to buy what it is you're selling. Customers are buying all kinds of, they're like veterinarians, right? They have all these different animals coming in that they're buying where we're like neurosurgeons. We know we do one thing and we're neurosurgeon spine specialists. And we already know that who should be involved and what criteria they should be using when they're comparing us side by side. And buyers are kind of woefully inadequate of doing this. So there's an opportunity for us to add value. And this is why I changed the frame to decision making, because later on we talk about getting this data in front of the customer. We're using that language about when you're making a decision, are these the people that are involved? Are these the criteria that you should be using? So it's a nice way to actually add some value during that process to help guide their decision to a more holistic one and bias toward you, of course.
Yep. That's the game. So this has been the estimation stage in the strategic negotiation process. Stay tuned for the next episode when we jump into signaling and validation based on what we've collected in this stage.
Thanks, Dan.